Every disaster begins before anyone realizes it has already started. At 13 on September 17, 1944, the sky over the Netherlands filled with aircraft in numbers never seen before. Engines stretched horizon to horizon. Paratroopers stood packed inside transports, waiting for green lights that meant the plan was already in motion. If it worked, the war in Europe could end before winter. If it failed, there was no contingency large enough to contain the consequences. This was Operation Market Garden. It depended on speed so absolute that delay itself would become the enemy. The concept was simple on paper and unforgiving in reality. Airborne forces would leapfrog deep behind German lines, seizing a chain of bridges across rivers and canals. On the ground, a single armored corps would race north along a narrow road to link them together. Once across the Rhine, Allied forces would bypass Germany's strongest defenses and push directly into its industrial heartland. The plan assumed surprise. It assumed weak resistance. It assumed bridges taken intact and held on schedule. Most critically, it assumed that time could be controlled. From the moment the first paratroopers jumped, that assumption began to erode. Drop zones were miles from objectives, chosen for safety rather than proximity. Men landed scattered across fields and villages, often under fire. Equipment came down separately, sometimes nowhere near the units that needed it. Radios failed almost immediately, leaving airborne commanders blind to each other's progress. German resistance was stronger than expected. Units thought to be refitting or incapable of action responded with speed and coordination. Armored elements were present where intelligence had said there would be none. They moved faster than anticipated, sealing off approaches and isolating airborne troops before relief could reach them. On the ground, the armored advance became trapped by its own design. A single elevated road carried every vehicle, every supply truck, every tank. Any disruption halted everything behind it. Ambushes, destroyed bridges, and traffic congestion slowed the column hour by hour. There was no alternate route. There was no flexibility. At each bridge, the clock tightened. Airborne units fought to hold positions they could not reinforce, waiting for ground forces that were always closer on maps than in reality. Ammunition dwindled. Casualties accumulated. Medical care collapsed under pressure. At Nijmegen, the delay became decisive. The bridge was eventually taken, but only after costly fighting that consumed time the plan did not have. Further north, at Arnhem, British airborne forces reached the final bridge but could not hold it against mounting pressure. Cut off, surrounded, and short on supplies, they fought on while the relief they needed failed to arrive. The weather turned against the operation. Cloud cover grounded aircraft, delayed resupply, and prevented reinforcements from landing on schedule. What had been designed as a rapid sequence became a series of isolated battles, each one draining strength from the next. By the time the decision was unavoidable, it had already been made by circumstances. The ground advance stalled short of Arnhem. The airborne troops there were withdrawn under fire, leaving behind the bridge that had been the operation's central objective. Market Garden ended not with collapse, but with exhaustion. The Allies held new ground, but not the breakthrough they had gambled on. The Rhine remained uncrossed. The war continued into winter exactly as the operation had been designed to prevent. The failure was not the result of a single mistake. It was the accumulation of assumptions stacked too tightly together. Each one had to hold. When several did not, there was no room left to adapt. Market Garden was ambitious because it tried to end the war quickly. It failed because it could not tolerate delay, and delay is what war always provides. The days that followed revealed the cost of ambition measured against reality. Airborne units that had landed with precise objectives now fought simply to survive. Perimeters tightened. Ammunition was rationed shot by shot. Wounded men lay where they fell because evacuation was impossible under constant pressure. At Arnhem, the situation deteriorated by the hour. German forces consolidated, bringing armor and artillery into range of positions never intended to be held for more than a short time. Houses became strongpoints, then ruins. Streets changed hands repeatedly. Radio contact with higher command was intermittent or non-existent. The bridge remained visible, close enough to define the mission, unreachable enough to make it irrelevant. Further south, the ground advance continued, but without the momentum the plan required. Each mile was contested. The narrow corridor became known not for speed, but for vulnerability. German counterattacks cut the road repeatedly, forcing armored units to turn back and restore lines that should never have been threatened in the first place. Progress became maintenance. Air support, critical to the operation's success, arrived inconsistently. Weather scattered formations and delayed drops. Supplies fell into German-held areas as often as Allied ones. What reached the airborne units was rarely enough and never on time. The margin for error, already thin, disappeared entirely. Commanders faced choices that no longer resembled the original plan. Reinforce isolated units and risk further delay, or press forward and accept their loss. Each decision traded one failure for another. There was no option that preserved the operation's original intent. The withdrawal from Arnhem was conducted at night, across the Rhine, under fire. Men crossed in small boats, overloaded and exposed, leaving behind equipment, wounded, and those who could not move. The bridge that had anchored the entire plan remained in German hands, intact and unusable. Market Garden officially ended shortly afterward. The front stabilized south of the Rhine. The Netherlands north of the line remained occupied. Civilians there would endure a winter of hunger and deprivation as supply routes stayed closed and relief failed to arrive. In hindsight, the operation revealed a tension that had been growing within Allied command. The desire to end the war quickly competed with the reality of German resilience and geography. Market Garden chose speed over certainty, assuming that success could outrun resistance. It did not. The failure did not reverse Allied momentum, but it reshaped it. The war continued along a slower, more methodical path. Rivers were crossed deliberately. Cities were taken at high cost. The winter that Market Garden had hoped to avoid arrived on schedule. The operation entered history not as recklessness, but as overconfidence constrained by time. It demonstrated how modern war punishes plans that cannot absorb friction. Market Garden was the most ambitious Allied operation of the war in the West. And ambition, unsupported by margin, proved insufficient. The consequences extended beyond the battlefield. The failure to secure a Rhine crossing froze the front in place at the edge of Germany. Supply lines strained. The ports needed to sustain a rapid advance remained unusable for weeks. The opportunity to exploit German disarray after Normandy closed quietly, without a dramatic reversal, simply by not being taken. For the airborne troops, the cost was immediate and personal. Units that had landed with full strength were reduced to fragments. Losses were severe, not only in killed and wounded, but in captured men who would spend the rest of the war in camps. The assumption that airborne forces could be relieved quickly had proven fatal when speed failed. German command, surprised by the scale of the operation, recovered faster than expected. Improvised units were thrown together, then hardened by contact. The failure at Arnhem became a rallying point, not because it changed Germany's situation, but because it demonstrated that the Allies could still be stopped when plans depended on precision rather than depth. On the Allied side, the lessons were absorbed cautiously. There was no public reckoning at the time, no admission of miscalculation. Officially, the operation had advanced the front and inflicted losses. Unofficially, it had revealed how little tolerance existed for delay when plans were stretched to their limit. The narrow road north became a symbol of that limit. Everything depended on it, and it could support only so much. Tanks, trucks, infantry, artillery, all forced into single file. When it was cut, even briefly, the entire structure stalled. The design left no redundancy. War exploited that immediately. In the months that followed, operations were planned differently. More routes, more reserves, fewer assumptions about enemy weakness. The tempo slowed, not because urgency had faded, but because certainty had become more valuable than speed. Market Garden did not fail because its objectives were wrong. Crossing the Rhine was necessary. Breaking into Germany was inevitable. It failed because it attempted to compress too much decision into too little time, relying on perfect execution across hundreds of miles and thousands of moving parts. Perfect execution does not exist in war. By the time the Allies crossed the Rhine in 1945, they did so with overwhelming force, multiple crossings, and depth that absorbed resistance rather than outran it. The contrast was stark. What had been gambled on in Market Garden was later achieved methodically, at far greater cost in time, but with certainty. The bridges that had defined the operation remained where they were. Some were destroyed. Some stood unused. They marked points on a map where ambition had met friction and lost. Market Garden did not end the war early. It ensured that the war would end the hard way, and that, more than any single failure, defined its place in history. The men who planned Market Garden did not intend it as a gamble. They intended it as a solution. The logic was coherent. The timing appeared favorable. German forces were retreating, disorganized, overstretched. Allied air superiority was uncontested. Momentum felt real, almost tangible. What the plan underestimated was not the enemy alone, but the environment in which precision had to operate. Rivers did not move, roads did not widen, weather did not obey schedules. Bridges either stood or fell, and they did so on their own terms. The airborne concept magnified every delay. A unit held up for hours did not merely fall behind. It became isolated. A missed drop zone did not just complicate movement. It severed coordination. Each problem compounded the next, tightening the operation until nothing could move freely. At Arnhem, this compression became fatal. The bridge was reached, briefly held, and then turned into a fixed point around which everything else failed. German armor arrived faster than expected. Artillery was positioned methodically. The airborne perimeter shrank not because of panic, but because it could not expand. Every building lost reduced options. Every hour without relief erased the plan's remaining logic. Further south, success came unevenly. Bridges were taken, crossings secured, but always behind schedule. Victory at one point did not compensate for failure at another. The chain could not be completed unless every link held. That was the design's strength and its flaw. Command decisions became increasingly constrained. Reinforcing Arnhem meant slowing the ground advance. Accelerating the advance meant abandoning airborne units already committed. Each choice carried consequences that could not be reconciled. There was no longer a way to win the operation as conceived. There was only a way to end it. When the withdrawal was ordered, it was done without illusion. The objective was no longer success, but salvage. Men were extracted where possible. Equipment was written off. Losses were accepted because they could not be avoided. The operation concluded not with defeat on the ground, but with recognition at command level that continuation no longer served a strategic purpose. Market Garden left behind a distorted geography. A narrow salient pushed into enemy territory, vulnerable on both flanks. Territory gained that could not be exploited. Territory lost that had to be retaken later. The front became awkward rather than decisive. For the civilians of the Netherlands, the consequences were severe and prolonged. Areas liberated too late, or not at all, endured occupation through the winter. Supply lines remained closed. Food shortages worsened into famine. The gap between intention and outcome was measured not only in military terms, but in human cost that extended far beyond the operation's end. In military history, Market Garden is often reduced to a single phrase: a bridge too far. That phrase simplifies something more complex and more instructive. The failure was not distance alone. It was density. Too many assumptions, stacked too closely, without space for friction to operate harmlessly. Market Garden revealed a truth that modern war enforces relentlessly. Speed without redundancy is vulnerability. Precision without margin becomes fragility. Ambition, when compressed into a single axis, invites failure that cannot be localized or contained. The war did not punish the Allies for trying. It punished them for assuming that success could outrun reality. When the Rhine was finally crossed, it was done slowly, deliberately, and everywhere at once. No single bridge mattered more than another. No single failure could unravel the whole. That was the lesson absorbed, quietly, without ceremony. Market Garden remained behind as a marker of what happens when war is asked to end on a schedule. It never does. In the months after the operation, the debate over Market Garden never fully settled. It did not need to. The battlefield had already delivered its verdict. The ground north of the Rhine remained out of reach. The war continued along routes that required time, resources, and attrition rather than boldness. The Allied advance resumed with a different posture. Planners no longer treated speed as a substitute for depth. Operations were built to survive delay instead of assuming it could be eliminated. When resistance appeared, it was absorbed rather than bypassed. The front moved forward unevenly, but it moved forward without risking collapse. For the airborne forces, the operation altered expectations permanently. They remained valuable, but no longer as instruments for decisive breakthroughs deep into enemy territory without immediate support. Their role narrowed, shaped by what Arnhem had demonstrated about isolation and endurance under pressure. German forces, though weakened, drew confidence from the failure, not confidence in victory, but in resistance. Market Garden proved that even in retreat, the Allies could be checked if they committed to a plan that required perfection. That understanding extended the fighting, even as it could not change the final result. The bridges of the Netherlands became quiet again. Some were repaired, some remained damaged. All stood as ordinary infrastructure long after the moment when they had carried disproportionate weight. The towns around them rebuilt slowly, bearing the cost of an operation that had promised liberation and delivered delay. Market Garden did not collapse in chaos. It unwound methodically, step by step, as each assumption was tested and found insufficient. The plan failed not because it lacked courage or imagination, but because it left no room for the war to behave as it always does. The ambition had been real. The effort had been immense. The margin had been too small. In that sense, Market Garden stands apart not as recklessness, but as a warning. It showed how even overwhelming force can be constrained by geography, weather, and time. How success at the tactical level can coexist with failure at the strategic one. How a plan can work almost everywhere and still fail completely. The war that followed was slower, heavier, and more deliberate. It carried none of the promise of sudden resolution that had animated the skies over the Netherlands in September. It carried instead the certainty that Germany would be defeated, but only through sustained pressure applied without reliance on a single decisive stroke. Market Garden was the moment when that certainty replaced hope. It was the most ambitious attempt to end the war early, and it was the moment the war refused. The refusal was quiet. It did not come as a counteroffensive or a dramatic reversal. It came as inertia, the kind that slows columns, grounds aircraft, stretches supply lines, and turns bold movement into measured advance. Market Garden had tried to force the war to conclude on Allied terms. The war responded by asserting its own. The Netherlands remained divided. In the south, liberation brought movement and supply. In the north, occupation tightened. Rail lines stayed closed. Food shipments failed to arrive. The winter that followed became a humanitarian crisis born indirectly from an operation that had promised speed and deliverance. The distance between military planning and civilian consequence widened. Within Allied command, there was no single reckoning, but there was adjustment. The appetite for singular solutions diminished. Future operations emphasized breadth over reach, multiple axes instead of one, redundancy instead of elegance. The belief that the enemy was on the verge of collapse was replaced by the understanding that collapse still had to be forced. The memory of Arnhem lingered precisely because it was so close. The bridge had been reached. The objective had been visible. Success had felt tangible enough to touch, and that proximity made the failure harder to dismiss. It was not an abstract lesson. It was a physical one, measured in streets, buildings, and a river that could not be crossed in time. For the soldiers who had jumped, fought, and withdrawn, Market Garden was not remembered as a grand plan, but as a sequence of constraints. Too far, too slow, too narrow, too late. Those words replaced the optimism of the briefing rooms. They followed units into later campaigns, shaping decisions that favored caution where boldness once dominated. The war moved forward anyway. It always does. New operations took shape along the Rhine, supported by overwhelming force and patience measured in months rather than days. When crossings finally came, they were not gambles. They were inevitabilities constructed piece by piece until resistance could no longer respond. Market Garden remained behind as an exception, a moment when ambition briefly exceeded tolerance, a plan that worked almost everywhere and therefore failed entirely. It was not the most costly Allied operation of the war. It was not the most chaotic. It was the most revealing. It showed that even at the height of momentum, even with air superiority, numerical advantage, and initiative, war cannot be compelled to end early. It can only be pressured until it gives way. The skies over the Netherlands cleared after September. The bridges stayed where they were. The Rhine remained a boundary until it no longer mattered. Market Garden ended without victory or collapse. It ended with the war continuing. And that continuation defined everything that followed. What followed Market Garden was a recalibration rather than a retreat. The Allies did not abandon ambition, but they learned where it failed. The war resumed its forward motion, stripped of illusion, driven by accumulation instead of maneuver. The geography that had promised a shortcut now imposed a cost. Flooded lowlands, rivers held by prepared defenses, cities that could not be bypassed without consequence. The idea of leaping over resistance gave way to the necessity of dismantling it piece by piece. Progress slowed, but it became irreversible. Market Garden lingered in planning rooms as a boundary, rarely named directly, but always present. It marked the line between what could be imagined and what could be sustained. After it, no operation depended on a single corridor. No plan assumed uninterrupted movement. No timetable ignored friction. For the airborne troops, the war continued with altered expectations. They would still jump, still fight, still hold ground under pressure, but never again as the linchpin of a campaign that could not function without perfect timing. Arnhem had demonstrated what isolation cost when relief arrived, measured in days instead of hours. German resistance hardened into defense without hope. The brief confidence gained from stopping Market Garden did not last. It could not be converted into initiative. It only prolonged the fight. Each delay purchased by resistance now worked against Germany's remaining capacity to endure. The Netherlands paid the price for that prolongation. Areas left behind the stalled front endured occupation through winter. Hunger spread. The human cost of delay extended far beyond the battlefield, into homes and streets that had expected liberation and received postponement instead. Market Garden did not fail because it was poorly conceived. It failed because it asked the war to end on Allied terms before the conditions existed to enforce that ending everywhere at once. It treated momentum as substitute for depth. It assumed the enemy would collapse in sequence rather than resist in fragments. War does not collapse cleanly. When the final crossings came in 1945, they were unremarkable by comparison. There was no single bridge that mattered more than another, no airborne drop that decided the campaign. The Rhine was crossed because it could no longer be held, not because it was outflanked. Market Garden remained an outlier, an operation defined not by disaster, but by proximity to success. Close enough to believe, close enough to fail. It stands as the moment when the Allies tried to end the war early and learned why it could not be rushed. After that, the war ended the only way it ever does, by force applied everywhere until nothing is left to give. By the time that lesson was fully absorbed, Market Garden had already taken its place as a reference point rather than an argument. It no longer needed defending or condemning. Its outcome spoke clearly enough through what followed it. The operation had revealed the limit of operational elegance. A plan that looked decisive on a map proved brittle on the ground. Each assumption depended on the next. Each success required another success immediately afterward. When one element slowed, the entire structure lost coherence. War exploited that without intention, simply by being what it is. What made Market Garden endure in memory was not the scale of loss, but the scale of expectation. It had promised compression, fewer battles, fewer months, fewer casualties in total. When it failed, the war did not punish the Allies with defeat. It punished them with continuation. Continuation meant winter fighting. It meant urban combat along rivers and canals. It meant supply problems solved slowly instead of bypassed. It meant casualties accumulated over time rather than risked in one decisive stroke. The price was paid incrementally instead of all at once. The bridges that had defined the operation faded back into geography. They became crossings again, not objectives. The airborne drop zones returned to farmland. The narrow road that had carried an entire army reverted to a provincial route. Nothing in the landscape explained why so much had depended on such ordinary places. Market Garden did not fail loudly enough to end confidence, but it failed clearly enough to reshape behavior. The Allied command emerged more cautious, more systematic, and more willing to accept time as a necessary cost. The war slowed, not because urgency disappeared, but because illusion did. In the end, Market Garden mattered less for what it changed than for what it prevented. It prevented further attempts to end the war through a single, narrow thrust. It closed the door on shortcuts. It forced the final campaigns to be built on depth, redundancy, and overwhelming pressure applied everywhere at once. That pressure would eventually break Germany, but not quickly and not cleanly. Cities would be reduced. Rivers would be crossed under fire. Casualties would continue to mount. The war would end, but not early. Market Garden stands as the moment when ambition ran ahead of structure, and structure reasserted itself. It was the most ambitious Allied operation of the war in the West. And it failed not because it was reckless, but because war does not reward plans that cannot survive delay. The bridges remained. The war went on. The war that followed Market Garden unfolded without shortcuts. There were no more attempts to compress distance into days or weeks. The advance resumed along a broad front, grinding forward through terrain that had to be taken rather than bypassed. Each river became a battle. Each city became a problem to be solved deliberately. The memory of Arnhem lingered precisely because it had been so close to working. The bridge had been reached. The plan had not collapsed immediately. It had failed slowly as time accumulated against it. That kind of failure leaves a deeper mark than sudden defeat. It forces recognition rather than denial. For Allied planners, the conclusion was unspoken but firm. Victory would come not from elegance, but from weight. Not from a single decisive stroke, but from sustained pressure applied everywhere the enemy stood. Market Garden had shown what happened when too much depended on too little. For the Germans, the operation's failure confirmed something they already sensed. They could still disrupt, they could still defend, but they could no longer dictate. Even their successes now functioned only as delays, buying time that had no strategic value left to spend. The Netherlands remained a reminder of that cost. Liberation came unevenly. Some areas celebrated early. Others waited through hunger and cold, while the front stalled just beyond reach. The promise of September turned into the reality of winter, shaped by a plan that had outrun its own margins. When historians later argued over Market Garden, they often focused on details: drop zones, intelligence failures, the narrow road. Weather, each mattered. None alone explains the outcome. The operation failed because it asked for perfection from too many variables at once, and war does not permit that kind of precision for long. Market Garden did not change the direction of the war. It clarified its tempo. After it, there was no expectation that the end could be forced quickly. The only remaining question was, how much force, applied how steadily, would be required to finish it. That answer came in 1945, not through a single airborne drop or dramatic breakthrough, but through exhaustion, the kind that no plan can shortcut and no ambition can bypass. Market Garden remains the moment when the Allies tried to end the war early and learned that even overwhelming momentum cannot escape friction. The bridges stood, the river held, and the war continued exactly as long as it had to. What endured after Market Garden was not controversy, but acceptance. The operation had not been reckless. It had been logical, bold, and rooted in a real opportunity. That was precisely what made its failure matter. It showed that opportunity alone was not enough when every element had to succeed on time, without deviation. The war resumed its slower rhythm, and in that rhythm the lessons hardened. Forces were built up rather than rushed. Rivers were crossed with overwhelming preparation. Airborne troops were used where isolation could be tolerated, not where relief was assumed. The margin returned to planning, not as an afterthought, but as the central requirement. Market Garden faded from daily relevance, but it never disappeared from understanding. It became the quiet reference behind decisions that favored certainty over speed. When the Rhine was finally crossed, it was not dramatic. It was inevitable. No single bridge mattered more than another. No failure could unravel the whole. That was not coincidence. It was design informed by experience. The bridges of the Netherlands remained where they had always been, ordinary structures that had briefly carried the weight of ending a war early. They did not collapse. They did not vanish. They simply outlasted the plan that had depended on them. Market Garden did not end in catastrophe. It ended in realization. The realization that even at the height of momentum, war resists compression, that it demands time, depth, and acceptance of friction, that ambition without space to absorb delay becomes vulnerability. The operation had promised an early end. What it delivered was clarity. After Market Garden, there were no more shortcuts left to try. That clarity settled in quietly, without ceremony or announcement. The war did not change direction. It changed texture. After Market Garden, operations felt heavier, slower, more deliberate, as if every movement now acknowledged something that had been proven and could not be disproven again. The Allies no longer planned around what might collapse. They planned around what would resist. German forces were treated not as a retreating mass that could be outpaced, but as a system that would continue to fight wherever it was allowed to stand. That shift removed optimism from planning and replaced it with inevitability. Market Garden had been built on the idea that momentum could substitute for preparation, that if enough pressure was applied quickly enough, resistance would fracture in sequence. What the operation revealed was that resistance does not need coherence to be effective. It only needs time. At Arnhem, time had been the enemy. At Nijmegen, it had slipped away. Along the corridor, it had been consumed by friction that no amount of resolve could erase. Each delay had been small. Together, they had been decisive. In the months that followed, no plan depended on minutes turning into hours, or hours turning into days without interference. Timelines expanded, objectives overlapped. Redundancy replaced elegance. The war became something to be dismantled rather than bypassed. The men who had fought in Market Garden carried that understanding forward, not as bitterness and not as regret, but as constraint. They knew now what happened when a plan left no room for delay, no space for recovery. That knowledge shaped behavior more effectively than any formal directive. The Rhine remained uncrossed through the autumn and winter, not because it could not be crossed, but because it would not be rushed again. When the crossing finally came, it arrived backed by weight that could not be contained by a single failure. It arrived everywhere at once. Market Garden remained behind as the exception, the moment when the war had been asked to end early and declined. It did not do so violently, it did so patiently. And patience, in the end, belonged to the side that could afford time. Market Garden ended without collapse, without disaster, and without resolution. It ended with the war continuing, stripped of illusion. The bridges remained standing. The river remained uncrossed. The front remained fixed just long enough for winter to arrive. What had been offered in September as a shortcut became, by October, a boundary that could not be forced. The ambition had been real. The logic had been sound. The execution had been brave and costly. None of that was enough to compress the war into a timetable it would not accept. Too many things had to go right, all at once, without delay. War provided delay immediately. After Market Garden, there were no more plans built on perfection, no more operations that depended on a single road, a single bridge, a single sequence unfolding exactly on time. The Allies did not lose confidence, they lost impatience. The war ended months later, not through surprise, not through speed, and not through daring leaps over resistance, but through weight applied everywhere until nothing remained to absorb it. Rivers were crossed because they could not be held. Cities fell because there was nowhere left to retreat. Germany collapsed not suddenly, but completely. Market Garden stands as the moment when the Allies tried to end the war early and learned why it could not be rushed. It was the most ambitious operation of the war in the West, and ambition without margin proved insufficient. The bridges stayed. The war went on, exactly as long as it had to.